Wind seemed to whisper secrets through the dense boughs. She was a little tired, having worked late, and the quiet solitude of the road was at first a welcome balm, a chance to clear her head before reaching her small cabin, nestled even deeper in the woods. The headlights cut a bright, focused tunnel through the impenetrable darkness ahead, and the only sounds were the soft hum of her engine and the occasional crunch of leaves beneath her tires. She'd been driving for perhaps 20 minutes when something flickered in her peripheral vision, a movement just at the edge of the tree line. It was too quick to identify, a shadow among shadows, and she dismissed it as a deer, a common sight out here. But then it happened again, a brief, almost imperceptible darting shape. She slowed down, her hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel, a faint prickle of unease beginning to spread through her. The forest, which had felt so comforting moments ago, now seemed to press in, denser and more watchful. Reminded herself that she was being silly, that her imagination was simply running wild in the dark. She pressed on, trying to focus on the yellow line stretching endlessly before her. That's when she saw it clearly, standing perfectly still at the very edge of the road, just outside the reach of her headlights. A figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, and draped in what looked like a dark, heavy cloak, its hood pulled low, obscuring any features. It was too tall for a person, she thought, a chill snaking down her spine. And it wasn't moving, not even swaying in the breeze that rustled the treetops. It simply stood there, a silent sentinel in the overwhelming darkness. Her heart began to thump a little faster, a frantic drum against her ribs. She gripped the wheel, her knuckles white. She told herself it was just a strange-looking man, perhaps a hiker caught out late or someone having car trouble. But the absolute stillness of it, the way it seemed to absorb the scant light, was profoundly unsettling. As she drew closer, her headlights finally illuminating the figure fully, she could see that the cloak was not fabric but something else, something organic, almost like dried, brittle branches woven together, or perhaps a layer of decaying bark. And beneath the hood, where a face should have been, there was only a deeper void, an absence that seemed to drink the light. Didn't slow down this time. Instead, an instinct, cold and sharp, seized her. She pressed the accelerator, her foot heavy on the pedal, wanting nothing more than to put as much distance as possible between herself and that silent, staring presence. As her car sped past, she dared a quick glance in her mirror. And that's when the true dread set in, a cold, suffocating wave. The figure was no longer at the roadside. It was standing directly in the middle of the road, behind her, facing her car, its head tilted slightly, as if watching her disappear into the night. It was closer than it had any right to be. She didn't look back again. She drove the rest of the way to her cabin in a blur of panicked adrenaline, her mind racing, trying to rationalize what she had seen. A trick of the light, exhaustion, a prank. But the image of that motionless, silent form, its head subtly tilted, remained burned into her mind. She locked every door and window in her cabin, pulling the curtains tightly shut, as if the thin fabric could keep out the unsettling memory. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of the wind, sounded like a footstep, a presence. And for weeks afterward she avoided that road, taking the longer, well-lit highway, even if it meant adding an extra hour to her commute. The quiet dread of that night settled deep within her, a tiny, persistent knot of unease that resurfaced whenever the shadows grew too long or the silence of the night felt too profound. She never saw the figure again, but the memory of its silent watchfulness, its impossible stillness, remained a chilling testament to the strange, unexplained things that sometimes drift into our paths in the darkest hours. And then there are the tales that don't involve strange figures in the woods, but rather the unsettling unraveling of the familiar, the subtle shifts in reality that make you question your own sanity, your own perception of what is true. Imagine, if you will, a quiet suburban house, bathed in the soft glow of where a family lives a seemingly ordinary life. A husband, a wife, and their young son, Alex. The wife, Sarah, was a meticulous woman, someone who found comfort in order, in routine. Her home was always perfectly organized, every item in its place, a sanctuary from the chaos of the outside world. It began subtly, with small, almost imperceptible changes. A book she was reading would appear on a different table than where she'd left it. Her favorite coffee mug, always rinsed and placed on the drying rack, would sometimes be in the cupboard, still damp. At first, she dismissed it as her own forgetfulness, a byproduct of a busy day. But the occurrences grew more frequent, more specific. She would put the remote control on the armrest of the sofa, only to find it later tucked precisely beneath a cushion. The car keys, which she always hung on a specific hook by the door, would sometimes be found on the kitchen counter, next to the fruit bowl. Her husband, Mark, was amused by her growing frustration. "Honey, you're just stressed," he'd say with a gentle smile. "We all misplace things." But Sarah knew with a deep, quiet certainty that she wasn't misplacing them. She was too careful, too habitual. She even started taking mental notes, little internal checks of where she left certain items just to be sure. And each time the item would appear somewhere else, deliberately, carefully moved. It was never truly hidden, never lost, just displaced. The most unnerving instance involved a small, porcelain bird figurine that sat on their mantelpiece. It was a gift from her grandmother, delicate and cherished. Sarah always kept it facing the window. One morning, she came into the living room to find it turned around, facing inward, its tiny painted eyes staring into the room. This was different. This wasn't just a simple misplacement. This felt deliberate, a silent message. She started to feel a profound sense of unease, a creeping feeling that she wasn't alone in her own home. She began to check the locks obsessively, even though nothing was ever stolen, nothing broken. It was just the subtle, relentless rearrangement of her belongings. She spoke to Mark again, her voice tinged with a raw edge of anxiety. He listened patiently, but his eyes held that familiar, slightly patronizing kindness. "Maybe you should see someone, darling," he suggested softly. "Just to talk about the stress." Sarah felt a surge of frustration, but she knew he meant well. She also knew, however, that she wasn't imagining it. This wasn't stress. This was something else. She started to set small traps, not for a thief, but for the invisible hand that was orchestrating these quiet disturbances. She would place a book with a bookmark halfway through, knowing she hadn't read it yet, and then later find the bookmark several pages back or forward. She would arrange her spices in the kitchen cabinet in a very particular order, only to discover one or two jars subtly swapped around. Then came the messages. At first, they were almost too subtle to be messages at all. A note she'd left for Mark on the fridge detailing groceries would have a single word crossed out and a new one written in her own handwriting, but not quite her style. A little more rounded, a little less hurried. She brushed it off as a half-remembered alteration she must have made herself. But then one morning she found a small, handwritten note on her pillow. It simply said, "You missed a spot." There was no signature. It wasn't Mark's handwriting, and it definitely wasn't hers. A cold dread seeped into her bones. She showed it to Mark, her hands trembling slightly. He looked at it, then at her, his brow furrowed with concern. "Sarah, are you sure you didn't write this yourself and forget?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "It looks just like your writing." It did. It looked uncannily like her writing, yet she knew deep in her gut that she hadn't written it. It was too neat, too deliberate. The quiet dread intensified. She felt like she was living in a glass box, and someone invisible was constantly tapping on the pane, reminding her of their presence, their observation. She started to wonder if she was truly losing her mind, if the stress Mark spoke of was manifesting in a terrifying, insidious way. One afternoon, while Alex was at school, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. She bought a small, motion-activated camera, the kind people use to monitor wildlife, and set it up discreetly in the living room, aimed at the mantelpiece where the porcelain bird sat. She wanted proof for herself, for Mark, for anyone who would listen. She went about her day as usual, cleaning, running errands, trying to act as normally as possible. That evening, after Alex was asleep, she and Mark sat down to review the footage. They fast-forwarded through hours of mundane emptiness, the dog walking by, sunlight shifting through the windows. Then, late in the afternoon, while the house was empty, it happened. The camera recorded the living room utterly still. And then, without a single visible person or disturbance, the porcelain bird on the mantelpiece slowly, almost deliberately, began to turn. It wasn't a sudden jolt, but a smooth, continuous rotation, until it faced inward just as Sarah had found it before. The footage was grainy but undeniable. There was no string, no gust of wind, no logical explanation. Just the silent, autonomous movement of the small ceramic bird. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Mark stared at the screen, his face pale, his usual skepticism replaced by a profound, unsettling horror. They replayed it several times, searching for an explanation, a trick, anything. There was nothing. Just the impossible, silent turn of the bird. The quiet dread that had been building in Sarah for weeks now blossomed into a full-blown, chilling terror. It wasn't her imagination. It wasn't stress. Someone or something was in their house, watching them, playing these unsettling games. They never found out who or what it was. They moved out of that house a month later, unable to shake the feeling of being constantly observed, of having their reality subtly undermined. The little porcelain bird stayed in a box, carefully wrapped, a chilling memento of the time their peaceful home became a stage for a silent, unseen presence. The memory of it still haunts Sarah, a reminder that some terrors don't scream or roar, but whisper, move, and rearrange, leaving behind a quiet dread that truly rattles the soul. And sometimes, the stories that linger are the ones that hint at a broader, older mystery, a hidden world just beneath the surface of our own. These are the tales that weave themselves into the very fabric of the landscape, tales of ancient places and the strange, enduring things that reside there. Consider the quiet corners of our world, the places where the modern clamor has not yet fully penetrated, where the trees grow ancient and gnarled, and the rocks seem to hold secrets whispered by time itself. There was an old man named Thomas, a recluse by nature, who lived in a small, weathered cabin deep within a forgotten valley. He was a kind man, though reserved, and he spent his days tending a small garden, reading old books, and exploring the surrounding wilderness. The valley was known for its dense fog, which often rolled in unexpectedly, shrouding the ancient trees in a thick, pearly mist that made the world feel ethereal and hushed. Thomas had lived there for over 50 years, and he knew every winding path, every hidden spring, every silent dell. He considered himself intimately acquainted with the valley's moods, its quiet rhythms. But there was one place he avoided, a particular grove of exceptionally old, twisted oak trees, whose branches seemed to claw at the sky like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath them was perpetually dark, even on the days, and the air always felt unnaturally still, heavy with an inexplicable silence. Locals, those few who even remembered the valley's existence, whispered tales of that grove, calling it the Whispering Place, though no one could quite explain why. Thomas, pragmatic as he was, initially dismissed these stories as old wives' tales, the product of overactive imaginations. But as he grew older, and as he spent more time in the solitary embrace of the valley, a subtle, intuitive respect for the grove began to grow within him. He never went there, not directly. He would skirt its edges, always keeping a respectful distance, a quiet agreement between man and unknown. One summer, a young botanist named arrived in the valley. She was bright, enthusiastic, and utterly fascinated by the unique flora of the region. She sought out Thomas, having heard he was the most knowledgeable person about the area, and asked him to guide her. Thomas, reluctantly, agreed, drawn by her genuine passion, but he made one condition: they would not go into the Whispering Place. Naturally was intrigued. "Why not, Mr. Thomas?" she asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Is there something dangerous there?" Thomas paused, choosing his words carefully. "Not dangerous in the way you might think, child," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's different, old, it just feels wrong." Though respectful, couldn't quite let go of the idea. The grove, with its ancient oaks, was exactly the kind of place where unique, undisturbed plant life would thrive. She promised Thomas she would honor his wishes, but the curiosity simmered beneath her polite exterior. A few weeks into her research, a thick, impenetrable fog descended upon the valley, the kind that swallows sound and blurs all familiar landmarks. Thomas warned her to stay close to the cabin, but eager to document a rare moss she discovered, decided to venture out, just a little way, believing she knew her path. She brought her camera, her notebooks, and a quiet determination. As often happens in dense fog, she quickly became disoriented. The world dissolved into a soft, monochromatic haze, and the familiar trees became indistinct shapes. She wandered for what felt like hours, calling out occasionally, her voice swallowed by the damp air. And then she stumbled upon it, the ancient oak grove. She knew it immediately, even through the swirling mist, by the sheer size and twisted forms of the trees, and the profound, almost unnatural silence that permeated the air within its boundaries. It was as if the fog itself was thicker here, heavier, muffling every sound. A strange mixture of fear and exhilaration coursed through her. She was in the forbidden place. She remembered Thomas's warning, the quiet dread in his eyes when he spoke of it. But the botanist in her, the seeker of knowledge, urged her forward. She pulled out her camera, wanting to capture the eerie beauty of the ancient trees shrouded in mist. As she raised it to her eye, she heard it. It wasn't a whisper of wind. It wasn't the rustle of leaves. It was a sound, faint and ephemeral, like countless voices, murmuring just beyond the edge of hearing, a cascade of indistinct words just on the periphery of understanding. It sounded ancient, sorrowful, and utterly alien. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, swirling in the thick air around her. It was the whispering place indeed. Froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The camera dropped from her nerveless fingers, hitting the soft, dark earth with a muffled thud. The whispers intensified slightly, not louder but more insistent, as if whatever was speaking was now aware of her presence, trying to communicate. She couldn't make out words, but the sheer volume of spectral voices, their ancient, mournful tone, filled her with a profound, unshakable terror. It was the sound of 1,000 forgotten things, a chorus of long-lost echoes, all trapped within that silent grove. She didn't scream. The sound would have been swallowed instantly by the oppressive silence and the swirling fog. She simply turned and ran, blindly crashing through the undergrowth, away from the whispering, away from the ancient dread that emanated from the very soil of that place. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached, until the whispers finally began to recede, fading back into the pervasive quiet of the fog. She eventually stumbled out of the fog, disheveled and shaking, hours later, back towards Thomas's cabin. He found her on his porch, huddled and weeping, her face streaked with dirt and tears. He didn't ask what happened. He simply looked at her with a knowing, sorrowful expression and brought her inside, making her a warm cup of herbal tea. Eventually left the valley, her scientific curiosity forever tempered by a deep-seated awe and a chilling respect for the unknown. She never spoke in detail about what she heard in the whispering place, only that it was a sound she would never forget, a sound that spoke of things far older and stranger than humanity could ever comprehend. Thomas, for his part, continued his solitary life, tending his garden, but now, whenever the fog rolled in, he would look towards the ancient grove, his gaze holding a quiet understanding of the dread that truly lurked in those deep, forgotten corners of the world. And sometimes, even in the quiet of his own cabin, he could almost hear a faint, ancient murmuring carried on the wind, a reminder of the secrets the earth holds. Then there are the stories that involve the very fabric of our perceptions, the moments when reality itself seems to bend, leaving us questioning what is truly real and what is merely a trick of the mind. These are the tales that delve into the delicate balance of our sanity, nudging us into uncomfortable introspection about the reliability of our senses. Consider a young man named Leo, an aspiring writer who, in pursuit of quiet inspiration, rented a small, isolated apartment in an old building at the edge of the city. It was cheap, had a single window overlooking a forgotten alley, and was almost perfectly silent, save for the occasional distant hum of traffic. Leo found the silence initially liberating. He could write for hours, his thoughts flowing freely, undisturbed. But as the weeks turned into months, the silence began to take on a different quality. It became less of an absence of sound and more of a presence, a watchful, waiting entity. He started to notice subtle things. A faint, almost musical hum that would sometimes rise and fall in the dead of night, too low to be a neighbor's television, too rhythmic to be the wind. He'd strain his ears, trying to pinpoint its source, but it would always fade before he could quite grasp it. Then came the reflections. His apartment had an old, ornate mirror in the hallway, inherited from the previous tenant. Lee usually paid it no mind, seeing only his own tired reflection as he passed. But one evening, as he walked by, he caught a flicker of movement in its depths. Not his own, but something else, a fleeting shadow darting across the background, even though he knew there was only a blank wall behind him. He stopped, stared intently, but the mirror showed only his reflection, the empty hallway. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, the tiredness of his eyes. But the flickers continued. They were never distinct, never solid, always just at the edge of vision, like a mote of dust too quick to catch, or a disturbance in the air currents. They always appeared in the mirror, never in his direct line of sight. It began to make him uneasy. He started to consciously avoid looking into the mirror, walking past it with his gaze fixed forward. One night, as he was immersed in his writing, he heard a soft, scratching sound coming from the hallway. It was rhythmic, persistent, like fingernails lightly dragging across a wooden surface. He paused his typing, his breath catching in his throat. He slowly pushed back his chair and walked towards the hallway, his heart thumping. The scratching stopped the moment he stepped out of his study. The hallway was empty, silent, save for the echoes of his own breathing. He looked towards the mirror, its surface dark and reflective in the dim light. He saw nothing unusual. He went back to his study, but the quiet dread had begun to settle. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He tried to write, but his concentration was broken. He kept glancing towards the doorway, listening for the scratching, for the hum, for anything. That night, as he lay in bed trying to force himself to sleep, he heard the faint hum again, louder this time, a mournful, undulating melody that seemed to resonate from the walls themselves. The next morning, feeling sleep-deprived and on edge, he decided to cover the mirror. He found an old sheet and draped it over the ornate frame, hoping to block whatever unsettling reflections or psychological tricks it was playing on him. For a few days, the apartment felt calmer. The scratching ceased, the hum seemed to fade. Leo started to breathe a little easier, convincing himself it had all been a figment of his stressed imagination. Then he came home one afternoon to find the sheet draped neatly on the floor beneath the mirror. The mirror itself was uncovered, its reflective surface gleaming innocently. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. He lived alone. He always locked his door. There was no one else who could have done it. He picked up the sheet, his hands trembling, and covered the mirror again, meticulously tucking the edges in. The next day, the same thing. The sheet was on the floor. The mirror was uncovered. It was a silent, insistent message, a gentle but firm refusal to be ignored. Leo felt a slow, chilling panic begin to rise within him. It wasn't just a trick of the mind anymore. Something was actively engaging with him, subtly, persistently, within the confines of his supposedly solitary apartment. He felt a profound sense of intrusion, a quiet violation of his personal space. He spent the next few days in a state of heightened anxiety, sleeping fitfully, constantly listening, constantly checking. He tried to reason with himself to find a logical explanation. Could it be drafts, vibrations? But the sheet was always neatly folded, always on the floor, never haphazardly tossed. It felt deliberate, almost intelligent. One night he couldn't take it anymore. The silence, punctuated by the occasional, almost imperceptible hum, was driving him to the brink. He decided to confront the mirror, to stare into its depths and demand an answer, a sign, anything. He stood before it, his heart pounding, his reflection staring back at him, pale and haunted. He waited. Nothing happened. He reached out a trembling hand and slowly, deliberately pulled the sheet away. And then he saw it. Not a flicker, not a shadow, but a clear, distinct image. His reflection was there, yes, but just behind it, superimposed as if in the depth of the glass, was another figure. It was indistinct, shadowy, almost translucent, but undeniably there. It was tall and gaunt, its form vaguely human, its head tilted, much like the figure had seen in the woods. And it was staring directly at him. Its eyes, though unseen, felt with an overwhelming intensity. But the most terrifying detail was its hand. It was reaching out, almost touching his reflection's shoulder, its fingers long and skeletal. And on its index finger he saw a faint, shimmering ring. It was the same ring his grandmother had given him, a unique family heirloom he wore every day. The ring was on its hand. Leo screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore through the quiet apartment. He stumbled backward, knocking over a small table, sending books scattering. He didn't look back. He ran out of the apartment, down the stairs, and out into the bewildering familiarity of the street, not caring about his wallet, his phone, his laptop. He just ran. He never went back to that apartment. He never knew what that shadowy reflection was, or why it wore his ring, or why it chose to subtly torment him. The quiet dread of that experience etched itself deep into his soul, a permanent reminder that sometimes the reflection staring back at us is not always our own, and that the silence of the night can hold more than just peace. And so, the quiet dread weaves its way through the tapestry of our nights, not always with screams, but with whispers and unsettling movements, with questions that have no answers, and with an insidious erosion of our sense of safety and reality. These tales often touch upon the vulnerability of being truly alone, of facing something inexplicable when there's no one else to witness it, no one to corroborate the chilling reality of what you've experienced. It's in these moments of profound solitude that the most unsettling things can truly take root, blossoming into a fear that is not loud or dramatic, but deep, pervasive, and incredibly personal. Let us consider another thread in this tapestry, a story that speaks to the dread of isolation, of being stranded far from the comforting lights of civilization, where the wilderness itself seems to hold a breathing, ancient secret. This tale belongs to a young park ranger named David, who took a posting at a remote national park, a vast expanse of dense forest, towering mountains and hidden lakes, far removed from any major towns. He was an avid outdoorsman, finding solace and peace in the solitude of nature, and the idea of spending months patrolling untouched trails, mapping forgotten routes, and observing wildlife was a dream come true. His small cabin was nestled deep within the park, a good 2-hour drive from the nearest ranger station, accessible only by a winding, unpaved road that became impassable with heavy rain or snow. He had a radio for emergencies, a satellite phone that sometimes struggled with reception, and his trusty dog, a loyal German shepherd named Bear, as his constant companion. The first few weeks were idyllic, filled with long hikes, the scent of pine and damp earth, and the calls of unseen birds. He felt connected to the rhythm of the wild, a primal sense of belonging. The shift began subtly, as these things often do. It was during one of his routine patrols, deep in a section of the forest he hadn't explored much before. The trees here were older, taller, their canopy so thick that the forest floor was perpetually dim, even at midday. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of his boots and the soft padding of Bear's paws. He was using an old, hand-drawn map provided by the previous ranger, a map with cryptic notes and large, unmarked sections. He came across a small, dilapidated lean-to, barely more than a few decaying logs and a tattered tarp, half hidden by overgrown ferns. It looked ancient, abandoned decades ago. Curious, David pushed aside some thorny branches and peered inside. There was nothing much, just some rotting leaves and a few rusted cans. But tucked beneath a moss-covered log, he found a small, leather-bound journal. It was old, its pages brittle and yellowed, its cover worn smooth by time and dampness. He took it back to his cabin, his curiosity piqued. That evening, by the flickering light of his oil lamp, he carefully began to read. The journal belonged to a man named Elias, a prospector who had ventured into these mountains in the late 1800s, searching for rumored veins of silver. Elias' initial entries were typical of a man facing the wilderness. Practical notes on supplies, weather, the challenges of navigating the terrain. But as David read on, the tone began to shift. Elias' writing grew more erratic, his descriptions more vivid and unsettling. He spoke of a feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes in the trees. He wrote about strange sounds at night, not animal noises, but something else, something that easy categorization. Soft, rhythmic thumps from the surrounding darkness, like heavy, deliberate footsteps on damp earth. He noted that his dog, a fierce hound named Buster, would often cower and whine in his tent, staring into the night with a profound, unshakable fear. Then came the increasingly disturbing entries. Elias began to write about things being moved in his camp. Small items like his cooking pot or his axe would be found in slightly different places than where he'd left them. He initially blamed his own forgetfulness, the strain of isolation, but the occurrences grew more specific, more deliberate. He wrote of waking to find a circle of small, smooth stones meticulously arranged outside his tent flap, stones he hadn't placed there. The quiet dread in Elias' words was palpable, seeping through the faded ink. He started to describe a presence, a feeling of immense age and coldness, emanating from the forest itself. He mentioned a particular sound, a low, resonant thrumming that would sometimes vibrate through the ground, making the very air feel heavy. He believed it came from deep within the earth, from beneath the ancient mountains. He became convinced that something was deliberately trying to communicate with him, or perhaps to drive him away. The final entries were truly chilling. Elias wrote of seeing fleeting figures at the edge of his camp, tall and indistinct, always disappearing before he could get a clear look. He described the great sleepers, as he began to call them, ancient entities that resided beneath the mountains, disturbed by his presence. He detailed how the thrumming grew louder each night, how the whispers in the trees became more coherent, though still unintelligible. His last entry was a desperate, almost incoherent plea for help, a frantic scrawl about the sleepers rising, and the cold, hungry eyes watching him. The entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence. David closed the journal, his hands clammy. The remote cabin, which had felt so comforting just moments before, now seemed to press in, the silence outside suddenly heavy with the weight of Elia's words. He looked at Bear, who was lying by the fireplace, head up, ears slightly perked, staring intently at the darkened window. Was it just a coincidence? Or did Bear sense something too? For the next few days, David tried to dismiss the journal as the ramblings of a man driven mad by solitude. He told himself that Elias had simply succumbed to the pressures of the wilderness, that his mind had played tricks on him. But the images from the journal, the descriptions of the sleepers and the cold, hungry eyes, kept replaying in his mind. And then the subtle changes began in his own cabin. At first it was just small things, easy to explain away. His knife, always kept on the counter, would be found on the floor. A cup he'd used for coffee would be in the sink, even though he distinctly remembered washing it. But then he started to hear the thrumming. Faint at first, a low vibration that seemed to come from the very ground beneath his feet, rising and falling with an almost organic rhythm. It wasn't loud, but it was insistent, a deep, resonant hum that made the air feel thick and heavy. Bear, who had always been fearless, began to show signs of distress. He would whine softly at night, staring at the darkened corners of the cabin, his hackles slightly raised. He would often refuse to go outside after dusk, pulling back from the door with a low growl, an uncharacteristic fear in his eyes. This truly unnerved David. Bear was a powerful, protective dog, not easily frightened. One particularly foggy evening, as the valley once again became a canvas of swirling mist, David was sitting by the window, trying to read, but his attention was constantly drawn to the pervasive quiet and the subtle, deep thrumming that now seemed to fill the very air. He looked out into the shifting fog, and that's when he saw it. At the very edge of the tree line, just beyond the reach of his porch light, an indistinct figure moved. It was tall, impossibly slender, almost like a shadow given form. It moved slowly, deliberately, gliding rather than walking, its movements fluid and unnatural. It was obscured by the fog, appearing and disappearing as the mist swirled, but David could discern its general shape. And then, as a gust of wind briefly cleared the mist, he saw its head. It was elongated, almost insect-like, and as it turned slightly, he felt, rather than saw, eyes fixed upon his cabin, upon him. They were cold, ancient, and filled with a silent, consuming hunger. A profound, primal terror seized David. The descriptions from Elia's journal flooded his mind. The great sleepers, the cold, hungry eyes. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was witnessing something truly ancient, something that had been watching this valley for centuries, perhaps, and that his presence, like Elia's, had disturbed its quiet slumber. He stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, as the figure slowly, deliberately, took another gliding step forward, closer to his cabin. Bear, sensing his master's terror, let out a low, guttural growl, a sound of deep primal warning. He lunged at the window, barking furiously, a desperate attempt to drive away the unseen threat. The figure paused, its head tilting slightly, as if listening to Bear's frantic barks. Then, with an almost imperceptible movement, it melted back into the swirling fog, disappearing as completely as it had appeared. David spent the rest of the night huddled with Bear, a shotgun across his lap, staring at the windows, listening to the thrumming that now seemed to pulse directly from beneath his cabin. He knew he had to leave. The park, which he had once loved, now felt like a cage, surrounded by an ancient, unknowable presence. The next morning, as the fog lifted and the sun brought a deceptive sense of normalcy, David packed his essentials, loaded Bear into his truck, and drove out of that valley, never looking back. He abandoned his post, his dreams of a life in the wilderness shattered by a dread so deep it changed the very fabric of his perception. He eventually found a job in a bustling city, preferring the comforting noise and anonymity of crowds to the profound, watchful silence of the wild. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the city's hum dies down and the silence stretches, he still hears the faint, deep thrumming, a reminder of the great sleepers beneath the ancient mountains and the cold, hungry eyes that watch from the edge of the wilderness. He knows with a quiet certainty that some places are best left undisturbed, their secrets buried deep beneath the earth, for the peace of restless souls. And then there are the tales that speak not of ancient entities or mysterious figures, but of the insidious terror that can grow within the most familiar of places, the quiet unraveling of trust and safety within the very walls we call home. This is the dread that stems from human darkness, from the chilling realization that the most dangerous monsters often wear human faces, and that the illusion of security can be shattered by a single, terrifying truth. This is a story that unfolds in a small, close-knit neighborhood, where everyone knew everyone, and the sound of children playing echoed through the tree-lined streets on summer afternoons. There was a young couple, Sarah and Tom, who had just bought their first home, a charming, older house with a spacious backyard, perfect for their future plans. They were excited, full of the optimism that comes with new beginnings. Their next-door neighbor, an older man named Mr., seemed pleasant enough. He was a widower, lived alone, and kept to himself mostly, though he would always offer a polite wave or a brief, friendly conversation over the fence. He always seemed to be working in his immaculate garden, tending to his prize-winning roses. As Sarah and Tom settled in, they noticed a few quirks about Mr. He was incredibly neat, almost obsessively so. His lawn was always perfectly manicured, his hedges trimmed to geometric precision. They also noticed that he seemed to be home a lot. Every time Sarah looked out her kitchen window, he seemed to be in his garden, or tinkering in his garage, or simply sitting on his porch, watching the street. It was a little unusual, but they dismissed it as the habit of an older man with time on his hands. The first hint of unease came subtly. Sarah started to feel a strange sensation, a prickle on the back of her neck as if she were being watched. It would happen when she was in her backyard, hanging laundry or watering her nascent flower beds. She'd turn around suddenly, expecting to see something, but there would be nothing, just the empty expanse of Mister's perfectly tended garden, perhaps with him quietly weeding in the distance, his back to her. She told herself it was just her imagination, the natural feeling of being in a new place. Then things began to move. Small things at first. A garden gnome she'd placed by her porch would be found moved a few feet to the left. A small potted plant on her patio would be turned slightly, facing a different direction. These were easily explainable, perhaps a strong gust of wind or even Tom playfully moving them. But then, one afternoon, she found her garden shears, which she'd left on a garden bench, meticulously cleaned and placed back in her garden shed. She knew she hadn't put them away. She had been called inside suddenly by a phone call and had intended to retrieve them later. A quiet dread began to seep in. She mentioned it to Tom, who, like Mark in the previous story, was initially dismissive. "It's probably just Mister," he chuckled. "He probably saw them and thought he was being helpful." But even as he said it, a faint frown creased his brow. It was a little odd for a neighbor to enter their shed, no matter how well-intentioned. The occurrences grew more frequent, more unsettling. Sarah would find her windows, which she swore she had left slightly ajar for ventilation, meticulously closed and locked. Her backyard gate, which she often left unlatched for convenience, would be securely bolted. It was as if someone was quietly, persistently, enforcing an order upon her property, an order that was not her own. And always, Mister would be somewhere in his garden, meticulously tending to his roses, his back often to her, but the feeling of being watched was constant, a cold pressure between her shoulder blades. One evening, Sarah and Tom had friends over for a barbecue. They were all in the backyard, laughing, talking, the grill sizzling. Sarah went inside to grab more drinks, and as she passed the kitchen window, she glanced out. Across the fence in the deepening twilight, she saw Mister. He was standing perfectly still in his garden, amidst his roses, not tending to them but simply standing there, facing their house, his silhouette stark against the fading light. He was holding something small in his hand, a glint of metal catching the last rays of the sun. He didn't wave, didn't smile. He just stood there watching them, a silent, unsettling sentinel. The laughter from her friends suddenly seemed to fade, replaced by a profound, chilling quiet in her mind. She excused herself from the conversation, a tremor of unease running through her. Later that night, long after their friends had left, Sarah and Tom were cleaning up. Sarah went to lock the back door, and as she reached for the deadbolt, she saw something tucked into the crack of the door frame. It was a small, neatly folded piece of paper. She unfolded it, her heart beginning to pound. It was a handwritten note in neat, precise script. It said, "You left your gate unlatched again, and the shears were out. You must be more careful, dear. I am always watching." The note wasn't signed, but there was no doubt in Sarah's mind who it was from. The quiet dread that had been a subtle hum for weeks now erupted into a full-blown, suffocating terror. It wasn't just helpfulness. It wasn't harmless eccentricity. It was an invasion, a deliberate, calculated intrusion into their lives, a chilling statement of control. And the phrase, "I am always watching," resonated with a cold, terrifying weight. Tom read the note, his face paling, his easygoing demeanor replaced by a look of grim understanding. The silence of the night outside suddenly felt menacing, the rustle of leaves like hushed whispers. They spent a sleepless night, every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind sounding like a silent footstep in their garden, a watchful gaze from across the fence. The next morning they called the police, but without any direct threat or proof of a crime beyond the unsettling note and the small, unexplained movements. There was little the officers could do. They advised them to get security cameras, to keep their doors and windows locked, and to avoid confrontation. But the damage was done. The sense of security, the joy of their new home, was utterly shattered. They installed cameras, but the quiet dread remained. Every time Sarah saw Mister in his garden, tending his roses with meticulous care, she felt a cold knot in her stomach. His polite waves now felt like knowing signals, his brief conversations like veiled warnings. They started to live in a constant state of low-grade anxiety, always checking locks, always glancing at the camera feeds, always feeling that invisible, watchful presence. One afternoon, Tom was checking the security footage from the previous night. He fast-forwarded through hours of darkness, then suddenly he froze. The camera showed their backyard bathed in the pale glow of the moon, and then a figure slowly emerged from the shadows near their back fence. It was Mister. He was wearing dark clothes, moving silently, stealthily through their garden. He went directly to Sarah's small flower bed, knelt down, and carefully, meticulously, rearranged a few of her newly planted petunias, adjusting their spacing and alignment. Then he rose, cast a lingering glance at the back door, and melted back into the shadows of his own yard. It was not malicious vandalism. It was not theft. It was something far more insidious, far more terrifying. It was control. It was the deliberate, quiet invasion of their private space, a chilling demonstration of his constant observation and his unspoken belief that he had the right to dictate the order of their lives, even in their own garden. The quiet dread transformed into a profound, suffocating fear. Sarah and Tom sold the house a few months later, taking a significant loss. They couldn't live there anymore, couldn't shake the feeling of being under constant surveillance, of having their lives subtly dictated by the silent, watchful man next door. They moved to a different city, a different neighborhood, seeking anonymity and a renewed sense of security. But the memory of Mister standing silently in his garden, always watching, always arranging, remains etched in their minds, a chilling reminder that sometimes the quietest dread comes not from the unknown, but from the chillingly familiar, from the depths of human obsession, and the slow, insidious erosion of personal safety. The night, after all, holds not just spectral figures and ancient secrets, but also the unsettling truths of human nature, a quiet terror that can penetrate even the most secure walls, leaving us forever changed, forever looking over our shoulders, forever listening to the gentle whispers of the quiet dread.